The triangular building on 23rd Street has defined the New York landscape for over a century. The Flatiron. A limestone base, terracotta walls, a shape so distinctive that children recognize it before they know its name. There are more photographs of this single structure than almost any other building on Earth. It appears in movies, paintings, and advertisements. Architects study it. Tourists make pilgrimages to it. Preservationists fought for decades to protect it from demolition. They succeeded. The building survived. But survival is not the same as living. Since 2019, the Flatiron has stood empty, closed, dark, waiting. This is the story of what happens when an icon becomes too precious to destroy and too constrained to save. Before the Flatiron rose, the plot on the corner of Fifth Avenue and Broadway was considered almost useless. The problem lay in geometry. Manhattan was planned in 1811 according to a rectangular grid. Streets ran east to west. Avenues ran south to north. The system worked perfectly everywhere except where older, diagonal roads cut across the new plan. Broadway originated as a Lenape Indian trail, winding along a natural ridge across the island. When planners superimposed the grid onto the existing landscape, Broadway remained. It cut through the new streets at an odd angle, creating triangular lots wherever it intersected. Most of these lots were small, awkward. Developers built on them if they had to, usually low structures that didn't require complex foundations. No one considered anything tall. The lot at 23rd Street was particularly difficult. It tapered to the southern end of the block, just 29 feet wide at the apex. The base stretched about 190 feet along Broadway and 190 feet along Fifth Avenue. The total area was slightly over 18,000 square feet. That sounded significant until you saw the shape. A long, narrow wedge, unfit for standard office use. For most of the 19th century, a low residential building stood on this lot. No one considered it particularly valuable. The location was good. Madison Square lay just a block to the north. The neighborhood attracted theaters, restaurants, and hotels. But the shape of the lot itself repelled serious interest. Standard offices required rectangular spaces. Furniture fit against straight walls. Tenants expected regular rooms. The triangle offered none of this. Everything changed in 1899. The George A. Fuller Company was a Chicago construction firm that specialized in skeletal construction. They used steel frames instead of thick masonry walls to bear the weight of buildings. The method allowed for taller structures using less material. Fuller had built some of Chicago's tallest buildings in the 1890s. Now they wanted a headquarters in New York that would announce their presence. Harry S. Black led the company after Fuller's death in 1900. Black understood the value of spectacular architecture. A building wasn't just a place of work, it was an advertisement. A client who saw an impressive construction company headquarters could trust its skills. Black looked for a site that would demonstrate what the company could build on impossible terrain. The triangle at 23rd Street fit perfectly. The company acquired the lot in 1901. The price remains undefined in historical sources, but later accounts suggest the landowners settled for a modest sum, assuming no one else would offer more for such a bizarre piece of land. Black immediately hired an architect. The choice was obvious. Daniel Hudson Burnham had built a reputation as one of America's most prominent architects. Burnham had designed many buildings during the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. The White City, as the fair was called, showed millions of visitors what architecture could achieve when vision met engineering. After the exposition, Burnham received commissions from all over the country. His buildings combined classical proportions with modern steel construction. Clients trusted that he could deliver both beauty and stability. When Black approached him with the triangular lot project, Burnham accepted the challenge without hesitation. The problem did not lie in the height. Steel construction could handle 22 stories, without difficulty. The problem lay in the base. The narrow end of the lot required a foundation that could distribute weight evenly across a small area. Burnham worked with engineers on a solution that used deep steel piles embedded in Manhattan's hard bedrock. The structure would transfer the load down rather than out. The facade presented another challenge. Burnham chose a French Renaissance style that emphasized vertical lines and classical proportions. The base would be made of Indiana limestone, the same material used in many prestigious buildings of the period. The upper floors would receive cladding of terracotta, a lighter material that could be molded into intricate patterns and fired for fire resistance. Terracotta cost less than stone, but provided a similar visual effect from a distance. Newspapers tracking the project began using a nickname, Burnham's Folly. The name suggested that the architect had undertaken an impossible venture that would end in failure. Critics pointed to the narrow foundation. Winds hitting the high walls would generate massive stress. The building could tip over during a strong wind or storm. The skepticism was understandable. New York already had several tall buildings, but none were built on such a bizarre lot. Construction began in 1901. Crews excavated the foundation, reaching through rubble and fill to the hard rock beneath. Steel piles were driven deep. Concrete was poured around them, creating a solid base. Steel columns began to rise in the early months of 1902. The frame went up quickly, floor after floor, until the structure dominated Madison Square. Burnham oversaw every detail. The terracotta panels were made to his specifications. Windows were installed to maximize natural light while protecting the interior from heat. An elevator served all 22 floors. Steam heating and modern plumbing ensured comfort for future tenants. The building officially opened on October 1st, 1902. The skepticism immediately vanished. The building stood firm. The winds that swept through Madison Square did not topple the structure. Instead, they created something unexpected, a wind tunnel effect. The air accelerated as it passed around the building's narrow facade. Women walking by on the sidewalk experienced sudden gusts that lifted their skirts. Young men began gathering at the corner to watch. The police had to disperse them, supposedly using the phrase 23 skidoo. The expression entered American slang, though its exact origin remains a subject of debate among historians. Photographs began to multiply immediately. The shape of the building was photogenic from every angle. Photographers set up in Madison Square and captured the full triangle. Others shot from street level, emphasizing how the structure towered over its surroundings. Alfred Stieglitz, one of America's most influential photographers, captured several images of the Flatiron in 1903. His photos helped establish the building as an art object, not just an engineering novelty. Painters added their own interpretations. Edward Steichen created atmospheric images showing the building shrouded in mist. Alvin Langdon Coburn photographed it at twilight, when the lights inside glowed through the windows. John Sloan painted the view from his studio window, showing the Flatiron dominating the square. Within a few years, the building appeared in more works of art than most monuments that had existed for centuries. The Fuller Company occupied several floors for its own offices. The remaining spaces were leased to companies seeking a prestigious address. Publishers were particularly interested. The narrow offices were well suited for firms that needed space for desks and filing cabinets rather than large open areas. The monthly rent was moderate for a prestigious location. The building filled up quickly. The building that was supposed to be a folly became an instant icon. Burnham proved that an impossible lot could host extraordinary architecture. Black got exactly what he wanted. An advertisement that announced the Fuller Company's skills to everyone passing through Madison Square. The name Flatiron Building replaced the official name, the Fuller Building, in common usage. The form defined the identity. The steel construction that enabled the building of the Flatiron was a relatively new technology in 1902. Traditional tall buildings relied on thick masonry walls to bear weight. The taller the building, the thicker the walls had to be at the base. This method imposed a practical limit on height. The base walls became so thick that they ate up floor space on the ground level, rendering the space useless. The steel skeleton worked differently. Vertical columns and horizontal beams created a frame that carried all the weight. Exterior walls became a curtain hanging on the frame rather than a load-bearing structure. This allowed architects to build higher, without sacrificing interior space. William LeBaron Jenney utilized this method in the Home Insurance Building in Chicago in 1885, widely recognized as the first skyscraper in America. By the time the Fuller Company hired Burnham, skeletal construction had proven its reliability in dozens of buildings. The Flatiron utilized steel columns spaced throughout the triangular lot. Beams connected these columns, creating a rigid frame on every floor. Concrete floors rested on the beams. The entire structure transferred its weight down through the columns to foundations embedded in Manhattan's bedrock. The exterior curtain walls were attached to the steel frame but bore no structural load. The choice of terracotta for the facade of the upper floors reflected practical concerns. The material was lighter than stone, reducing the total weight the skeleton had to support. Terracotta could be molded into decorative shapes before firing, giving architects flexibility in design. After firing at high temperatures, the material became fireproof, an important feature in an era when building fires remained a constant threat. Indiana limestone covered the bottom 4 floors, providing a solid, traditional base that communicated durability and prestige. Burnham designed the facade in 3 vertical sections. The base spanned 4 floors, with limestone walls and large windows on the ground floor for shops. The middle section rose from the 5th to the 18th floor, where terracotta repeated columnar patterns that gave the building a vertical emphasis. The top comprised the final 4 floors, with more ornate terracotta and a corniced roofline that crowned the structure. The composition was classical in proportion, though the materials and construction method were modern. Windows covered most of the wall surface. Office buildings required abundant natural light. Electricity existed but was expensive and unreliable. Tenants expected spaces where they could work by daylight for most of the day. Burnham positioned windows to maximize sun exposure while maintaining the structural integrity of the facade. Thick steel window frames divided each opening into smaller panes that could withstand wind pressure at that height. The wind challenge was real. Madison Square was an open space surrounded by buildings that directed airflow. When the wind hit the narrow north end of the Flatiron, it accelerated around the sides, creating strong gusts at the base. The effect was dramatic enough for passers-by to notice. Newspapers reported incidents where hats were blown off people's heads, women held onto their skirts. Young men, as mentioned earlier, gathered to watch the phenomenon until the police intervened. Inside, the floor layout reflected the challenges imposed by the triangular shape. No floor offered the rectangular rooms that most companies preferred. Instead, each floor had long, narrow corridors leading from the wide southern end to the narrow northern tip. Offices lined the corridors, each occupying a narrow slice of the available width. Rooms at the north end were so small they could hold only a single desk and a filing cabinet. This odd geometry discouraged some firms, corporations that needed large open spaces for departments with many employees. Could not effectively use the triangular floors, but others found the layout worked well. Publishers, law firms, architects, and professionals operating in small groups found the narrow offices suitable. The Madison Square address carried prestige. Rent was reasonable compared to other modern office buildings. The location provided easy access to public transport and restaurants. The Fuller Company occupied several floors for its New York headquarters. The remaining floors were leased to various tenants. By 1905, the building was nearly fully occupied. The owners had no difficulty finding companies willing to overcome the quirky layout in exchange for an address in Manhattan's most recognizable building. The building's open floors from 1902 became an instant landmark. Passers-by used it as a reference point when giving directions. Photographs multiplied. Postcards depicting the Flatiron sold by the thousands. Publishers printed photos of the building and travel guides and brochures promoting New York as a modern metropolis. The triangular form was instantly recognizable, even to people who had never visited the city. Artists continued to paint and photograph the building for years. Each season offered a new mood. Winter covered the terracotta in snow. Spring brought soft light through Madison Square. Autumn twilights colored the facade in gold and red. No two images were identical. The building changed with the weather, time of day, and angle of view. Artistic photography found limitless possibilities in the Flatiron. The building's success confirmed several things. First, a lot considered useless could host something extraordinary if the architect understood engineering. Second, prestige had market value. Tenants paid for the 23 Madison Square address, even if the floor layout was inconvenient. Third, the public responded to bold architecture. Burnham's Folly became an icon, not despite its strange shape, but precisely because of it. For the first 2 decades, the building functioned exactly as Black intended, an advertisement for the Fuller Company's skills, a profitable property for the owners, a symbol of New York modernity for the general public. Tenancy stabilized. Maintenance remained relatively simple. The steel skeleton did not require the renovations that thick masonry walls would have needed. The terracotta facade weathered the elements well. No major disasters struck the structure. Fires that destroyed other Manhattan buildings spared the Flatiron. The terracotta and steel construction provided fire resistance that older wooden structures lacked. The elevator rarely broke down. Steam heating worked through the winters. The building required the same routine maintenance as any large commercial property, but nothing more. By the 1920s, the Flatiron was already part of the New York landscape. New, taller buildings were rising in Manhattan. The Empire State Building began construction in 1929 and opened in 1931, reaching a height of 281 meters. The Chrysler Building exceeded 300 meters. The Flatiron, at 77 meters, was no longer even close to the tallest, but it remained the most photographed, tall enough to dominate its surroundings at Madison Square, but not so tall that it lost its human scale. The form endured. For the first 60 years of its existence, the Flatiron Building bustled with life. Tenants moved in and out, but the building remained nearly fully occupied for most of that period. The types of businesses that rented space reflected Manhattan's economy and the evolution of American business. Publishers dominated in the early decades. Companies like the Frank Munsey Company occupied multiple floors. Munsey published magazines and newspapers, including Munsey's Magazine, which reached a circulation of 600,000 at its peak. Editorial offices fit well into the Flatiron's narrow offices. Journalists needed desks, typewriters, and filing cabinets. They did not need large open spaces. The 23 Madison Square address added credibility to their publications. Architectural firms also leased space. The irony was intentional. Architects could show clients that they worked in one of America's most famous buildings. This signaled an understanding of good design. The narrow offices gave them privacy for client consultations, while the availability of conference rooms allowed for presentations and reviews. Photographers maintained studios on the upper floors. Natural light pouring through the windows was ideal for portraits and commercial work. The mid-Manhattan location meant clients could easily visit for sessions. Some photographers specialized in views from the Flatiron's windows, selling images of Madison Square to tourists and collectors. Lawyers ran practices from the building. Smaller firms occupied single offices. Larger ones leased entire floors. A law library in the building served many tenants who shared the costs of maintaining the collection. The corridor layout allowed for discrete entrances to separate offices, which clients seeking privacy appreciated. In the 1930s, the tenant mix remained similar: creative industries, professional services, companies that needed a prestigious address but not vast square footage. The Flatiron never competed with newer skyscrapers in terms of sheer capacity. Instead, it offered something else: character, history, recognition. The Great Depression affected rental patterns, but not as severely as might be expected. Some businesses failed. Others downsized their space. But the building remained attractive enough that owners found new tenants for vacated spaces. Rent was flexible during hard times. Owners preferred taking less money than allowing long periods of vacancy. The Second World War brought further changes. Government agencies leased office space throughout Manhattan for military operations. The Flatiron accommodated several smaller offices related to the war effort. After the war ended, these spaces returned to civilian use. The post-war economy brought a new wave of commercial tenants. By the 1950s, the building was 50 years old. The steel skeleton remained solid. The terracotta facade had weathered well, though some panels required replacement where moisture had caused cracks. Mechanical systems began showing their age. Elevators needed more frequent repairs. Steam heating worked, but was less efficient than more modern systems. Plumbing sometimes failed. Owners invested in maintenance, but not in major upgrades. The economy did not support large capital investments. The building generated steady rental income with moderate maintenance costs. Radical renovations would have cost millions and might have required evacuating tenants during the work. The risk seemed unjustified. Landmark designation emerged as an issue in the 1960s. New York was losing architectural monuments at an alarming rate. Pennsylvania Station, a Beaux-Arts masterpiece designed by McKim, Mead, and White, was demolished in 1963, despite widespread public protest. The demolition sparked outrage and prompted activists to demand legal protection for important buildings. The New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission was formed in 1965. The following year, the Flatiron Building received landmark designation. The status protected the building from demolition and required commission approval for any major changes to the facade or important interior elements. Owners could not simply tear the building down even if the land became more valuable than the structure. Designation provided protection, but also imposed restrictions. Renovations required approval. Changes to the facade were subject to review. Owners had to maintain the exterior appearance in accordance with the original design. The regulations made sense from a preservation perspective. They protected the triangular icon from the bad judgment of future owners, but they also reduced flexibility. Modern office needs began to diverge from what the Flatiron could offer. Companies wanted open floor plans. Computers required specialized electrical and cooling systems. Air conditioning became a standard, not a luxury. The Flatiron had small offices, outdated wiring, and unreliable climate control. Modernizing these systems would mean tearing open walls and installing new infrastructure throughout the building. In the 1970s and 80s, some spaces became harder to lease. Larger corporations needing modern office spaces went elsewhere. Smaller firms that did not need state-of-the-art infrastructure continued to rent in the Flatiron. Traffic was mixed. Some months brought new tenants. Others saw departures. Owners managed the building profitably, but margins shrank. The building's cultural significance never waned. Movies featured the Flatiron as a backdrop for scenes in New York. Photographs continued to appear in travel guides, calendars, and advertisements. Artists painted it. Architecture students studied its design. Tourists were drawn to Madison Square specifically to see it. No other building in New York, with the possible exception of the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building, achieved such instant recognition. But fame does not pay maintenance bills. Through the 1990s, the building required serious attention. The terracotta facade needed extensive repairs. Minor cracks expanded into major problems as water seeped in and froze during winter, expanding the damage. Some panels were breaking off, posing a danger to pedestrians below. Scaffolding was erected around parts of the facade while repairs were conducted. Inside, the elevators required replacement. The original systems installed during construction had lasted for nearly 100 years, a remarkable testament to their quality, but they could not run indefinitely. New elevators needed modern motors, cabs, and control systems. The work was expensive and disruptive for tenants. Electrical and plumbing systems also needed modernization. Original wiring was not designed to handle computers, fax machines, and other electronic equipment that filled modern offices. Owners ran new cables through existing shafts and corridors where possible, but a total update would require tearing down walls throughout the building. Ownership changed hands several times in the final decades of the 20th century. Each new owner in the 1990s inherited the same set of challenges: a prestigious address, iconic architecture, aging systems, limited flexibility due to landmark status. Rental revenue was steady, but not spectacular enough to justify the tens of millions needed for a total renovation. By the end of the 1990s, the pattern had become clear. The Flatiron Building was celebrated publicly, but neglected privately. Everyone loved the building. Few people wanted to pay to fix it. Deferred maintenance accumulated. The problem worsened with each passing year. By the beginning of the 21st century, the Flatiron Building faced new challenges. Modern offices required infrastructure that the 1902 building was not designed to provide. Open floor plans became the norm. Companies wanted spaces where dozens of employees could collaborate without physical barriers. The Flatiron's long, narrow corridors with small offices lining each side represented the exact opposite of what modern tenants sought. HVAC systems in the building barely functioned. The original steam heating still worked, but it was noisy, inefficient, and impossible to control floor by floor. Air conditioning had been added piecemeal over decades, creating a patchwork system that delivered uneven results. Some offices were too hot in summer. Others were too cold in winter. Tenants complained regularly. Electrical wiring could not handle the power demands of modern equipment. Offices filled with computers, servers, printers, and other electronics required more circuits than the building possessed. Owners ran new wires where they could, but a complete upgrade would require tearing down walls and ceilings throughout the building. The cost would be huge. The disruption for tenants would be significant. Plumbing showed its age. Pipes installed during original construction had lasted remarkably long, but nothing lasts forever. Leaks became more frequent. Water pressure fluctuated. Some bathrooms had fixtures that were older than most tenants. Replacing the entire plumbing system would mean opening walls on every floor, a task comparable to rebuilding the entire building from the inside. Elevators still worked after their replacement in the 1990s, but the sheer number of elevators posed a problem. The building had only 4 cabs serving 22 floors. During peak hours, workers waited several minutes for an elevator. More modern office buildings provided more cabs and faster travel times. No physical solution existed for the Flatiron. There was no room to add more elevator shafts without demolishing key structures. Ownership passed to Harry Macklowe, a prominent New York real estate developer, in the 1990s. Macklowe understood both the value and the challenge. The building sat on 17,000 square feet of Manhattan's most valuable real estate. Even with its awkward geometry, the land was worth tens of millions. But landmark status meant he could not simply demolish the structure and start over. Macklowe considered conversion to condominiums. Luxury apartments in New York's most iconic building could sell for shocking prices. The location was perfect. Views from higher floors encompassed Madison Square and much of Manhattan. Historic prestige would add value that new buildings could never achieve. The plan faced immediate obstacles. The Landmarks Preservation Commission would have to approve any major interior changes. Conversion to apartments would require completely rebuilding every floor. Walls would need to be demolished. New plumbing layouts, kitchens, bathrooms, everything would have to be installed. Historic features like corridors, staircases, and certain ornamental elements would likely need to be preserved. The Commission rejected the proposal. Regulations governing landmark preservation prioritized maintaining the historic character of buildings. Converting the Flatiron from offices to apartments would fundamentally change its interior. The Commission argued that the building had served as an office building since 1902. This usage was part of its identity. Conversion would mean erasing that history. Macklowe eventually sold the property. The economics did not work without conversion to condominiums. The building still generated rental income, but not enough to justify the tens of millions needed to renovate systems while maintaining it as office space. New owners would face the same dilemma. In 2005, a new buyer entered the scene. Sorgenti Group, an Italian real estate investment firm, specialized in acquiring historic buildings and renovating them. They saw value in icons. Their portfolio included properties across Europe and the United States. The Flatiron fit their investment model: iconic architecture, prime location, potential for long-term value appreciation. Sorgenti paid about $190 million for the building in 2018, though exact figures remain disputed in various sources. The price reflected both the land value and the building's potential. The firm announced plans for a sensitive renovation that would modernize systems while preserving historic character. Initial inspections revealed problems more serious than anyone expected. The terracotta facade was cracking in many places. Water had seeped through micro cracks for decades, causing damage to the steel frame behind it. Some steel beams showed corrosion. Repairs would require stripping and replacing sections of the facade floor by floor. Inside systems needed complete replacement. Electricity, plumbing, HVAC, everything was long obsolete. Modernization would mean exposing the skeletal structure and rebuilding from the inside, while preserving the outer shell. The work would be complex and time-consuming. Costs were initially estimated at about $50 million. As inspectors dug deeper, the number rose: 80 million, 100 million. Final estimates suggested that comprehensive renovation could exceed $150 million. Added to the purchase price, the total investment would approach $350 million. Sorgenti moved ahead. The firm hired an architect and engineers. They received permits. They drew up a schedule. Work was to begin in early 2019. All tenants received notices. They would have to vacate the building temporarily while the renovation proceeded. The firm assured them they could return when the work was finished. In March 2019, the building emptied. The last tenants packed up their offices and moved to temporary locations. Some planned to return. Others took the opportunity to find modern spaces in newer buildings. The Flatiron Building, for the first time since 1902, stood silent. Scaffolding went up around the facade. Construction crews began work on the terracotta. Each panel required individual assessment. Cracked sections were marked for replacement. The process was slow. Craftsmen had to match new terracotta to originals from 117 years ago. Color, texture, dimensions, everything had to be identical. Finding suppliers who could produce replicas took months. Inside, demolition began in non-essential parts of the building. Old walls were torn down, exposing the steel skeleton. Outdated electrical wiring was removed. Plumbing pipes were cut. Plans called for entirely new systems, designed for the 21st century, but compatible with the historic structure. Then in March 2020, just a year after work began, the COVID-19 pandemic reached New York. Construction slowed, then stopped. Workers were sent home. Material supplies were delayed. The city shut down non-essential construction projects for months. The Flatiron renovation was suspended. The economic effects of the pandemic extended far beyond the construction site. Tourism in New York collapsed. Madison Square, usually full of visitors photographing the Flatiron, stood empty. Commercial real estate value dropped as companies adopted remote work. Offices that were previously essential became optional. Demand for spaces in Midtown Manhattan evaporated. Sorgente Group faced a financial crisis. Their Italian parent company struggled with debt even before the pandemic. Lockdowns made everything worse. Revenue from their real estate portfolio dropped drastically. Creditors began calling in loans. In August 2020, the Italian parent entity filed for bankruptcy. The Flatiron Building stuck in legal limbo. Renovation halted. The building remained empty. Scaffolding still wrapped the facade. The company owning the building was now controlled by a bankruptcy court in Italy. Creditors vied for assets. Potential buyers evaluated whether the Flatiron was worth acquiring with all its complicated legal and financial baggage. Months turned into years. The building remained dark. New York's most iconic building became its most abandoned. Tourists continued to photograph it, but now photos showed scaffolding and barricades instead of living architecture. The building that had survived 117 years was defeated not by time, but by economics. The years preceding the acquisition by Sorgente were marked by a series of owners who all saw the potential of the Flatiron, but didn't find a profitable way to utilize it. Each bought with plans that eventually fell apart. The economics were always the same. The cost of repairing the building exceeded what it could generate as office space. Conversion to residential use offered the best rate of return, but the Landmarks Preservation Commission blocked such plans. Macklowe tried the condominium approach first in the late 1990s. His vision included luxury apartments selling for millions per unit. The location in the very heart of Manhattan made the plan look feasible. But the commission maintained that conversion would destroy the building's historical integrity. The decision was final. Macklowe had no option to appeal. Another owner considered a boutique hotel model. Rooms in an iconic building could command premium rates. Tourists were drawn to the Flatiron specifically. Why not let them stay inside? The concept made marketing sense, but faced the same regulatory hurdles. Transforming the office interior into hotel rooms required serious structural changes. The commission would most likely reject these plans as well. Meanwhile, the building continued to function as office space, but the mix of tenants was changing. Traditional firms needing modern infrastructure were leaving. Smaller organizations with limited budgets were coming in. Some spaces were leased to startups and creative firms that valued the address more than modern amenities. Other floors stood empty for months. Rents could not be raised enough to cover the repair costs the building needed. Tenants paying market rates expected reliable air conditioning, fast elevators, and modern internet connectivity. The Flatiron offered none of these things consistently. Owners kept rents relatively low to maintain occupancy, but that meant rental income never reached levels necessary to fund a thorough renovation. The situation created a vicious cycle. Deferred maintenance worsened the building's condition. Deteriorating conditions made it harder to attract well-paying tenants. Lower rental income left less money for repairs. The downward spiral was gradual, but relentless. By 2010, the terracotta facade required immediate attention. Several panels had fallen off, forcing the city to require the installation of protective scaffolding. The structure covered sections of the sidewalk around the building, ensuring that falling debris did not injure passers-by. The scaffolding was temporary, but remained for years because owners postponed costly facade repairs. Inside, problems intensified quietly. The electrical system struggled to handle increased loads. Power outages affected some floors. Tenants filed complaints. Owners performed spot repairs but never solved the underlying problems. Wiring installed in 1902 was not designed to handle computers, servers, and other equipment drawing current continuously. The HVAC system became increasingly unreliable. Summer heat turned upper floors into ovens. Winter temperatures made some offices uncomfortable despite working heating. Tenants bought portable heaters and fans to supplement the inadequate building system. This was not a solution. It was an admission of failure. When Sorgente purchased the building in 2018, many in the real estate industry were skeptical. The purchase price was high. Known renovation costs were huge. Unknown costs could be even higher. But Sorgente had experience with difficult historical properties. They managed projects others considered impossible. They had access to capital through their Italian parent company. All elements for success seemed to be in place. Inspections conducted after the purchase revealed the full scale of the problem. The facade needed more than just spot repairs. Sections of terracotta had to be completely replaced. The steel underneath showed corrosion that required treatment. The work meant installing scaffolding around the entire building and proceeding floor by floor for months or years. The steel skeleton, though still structurally sound, needed inspection and maintenance. Engineers had to assess every beam and column. Corrosion, where present, required sandblasting and painting. Some elements might need reinforcement. 117 years of exposure to moisture and changing temperatures had left marks. The foundations remained solid. Deep steel piles embedded in Manhattan bedrock during original construction were still doing their job. This was a rare positive point in a long list of necessary repairs. The building's base needed no work. Everything above it did. Sorgente developed a detailed renovation plan. Phase 1 would address the facade, scaffolding installation, inspection of every panel, replacement of damaged sections, cleaning and preservation of the steel skeleton. Phase 2 would upgrade electrical and plumbing systems, all new wiring, new pipes, new fixtures. Phase 3 would install a modern HVAC system that could provide consistent temperature and humidity on all floors. Phase 4 would replace elevators with newer, faster units. Phase 5 would reconstruct interior spaces, creating more flexible office layouts while preserving historical elements. The entire project was estimated to last from 3 to 5 years. The cost, as mentioned earlier, ranged from $50 to over $100 million, depending on what additional problems might arise during work. Sorgente secured financing from both its Italian parent company and lenders who saw value in a well-executed renovation of an iconic building. In March 2019, all preparations were completed. Permits issued, contractors hired, schedules approved, tenants evacuated. The building emptied for the first time in its history. Scaffolding began to rise along the facade. Crews set to work. Early progress was encouraging. Terracotta panels were carefully removed and cataloged. Damaged ones were marked for replacement. Intact ones were cleaned and stored for reinstallation. The steel skeleton underneath was exposed for the first time since 1902. Engineers conducted inspections. Most of the structure was in better condition than feared, though some areas needed treatment. Inside demolition proceeded in non-public spaces. Old systems were removed, new shafts were prepared, electrical rooms were cleared and ready for modern equipment. The work was dirty, noisy, and time-consuming, but proceeded according to schedule during those first weeks. Then, in March 2020, the pandemic stopped everything. New York went into lockdown. Construction workers were sent home. Construction sites across the city emptied. The Flatiron joined thousands of other projects frozen in place by the health crisis. The pause, which was supposed to last weeks, stretched into months. Even after construction resumed, worker density restrictions and safety measures slowed progress. Material deliveries, supposed to arrive from around the world, were delayed or canceled. Supply chains fell apart. Schedules became useless. But the economic effects of the pandemic were far worse for Sorgente than construction delays. Their real estate portfolio across Europe and the United States suffered sharp revenue declines. Restaurants, retail stores, and offices closed. Tenants stopped paying rent. Property values dropped. The company, which had appeared financially stable in 2018, faced a liquidity crisis by mid-2020. Sorgente's Italian parent company carried significant debt even before the pandemic. Creditors, who had been patient during good times, became anxious when revenues fell. They demanded repayment. The company had no cash. In August 2020, Sorgente RESPA filed for bankruptcy in Italy. The Flatiron Building, owned by Sorgente's American subsidiary, was swallowed up in bankruptcy proceedings. An Italian court held authority over the firm's assets. Creditors filed claims. Potential buyers began circling, assessing if the building could be acquired at a discount from the bankruptcy estate. Renovation never fully resumed. Some work continued sporadically, but without steady funding and leadership, progress was minimal. Scaffolding remained. The building remained dark. The most photographed building in New York stood frozen, unable to move forward, unable to return to what it was. The COVID-19 pandemic did not just stop the Flatiron renovation. It changed the entire economy of commercial real estate in New York. Companies that previously required offices for all employees discovered that remote work worked better than anyone had predicted. Meetings took place via video. Documents were shared in the cloud. Productivity did not drop as drastically as managers feared. This revelation had immediate consequences. Companies that previously leased entire floors of office space began to reduce their footprint. Some leases were not renewed. Others were renegotiated for smaller spaces. Demand for offices in Midtown Manhattan dropped sharply. Building owners across the city saw vacancy rates rising to levels unseen for decades. For the Flatiron Building, which already stood empty, the effect was different but equally devastating. The building's value was based on its potential to generate rental income. If the office market collapsed, then even a fully renovated Flatiron would struggle to find tenants willing to pay the rates necessary to justify renovation costs. The economics, which were difficult in 2019, became nearly impossible by 2021. Tourism, the second key component of the Flatiron's value, also collapsed. Madison Square, usually full of visitors from around the world, emptied out. Restaurants and hotels closed. Those that survived operated with drastically reduced revenues. The location, which was one of the building's main assets, was losing value when there were no visitors. Bankruptcy proceedings in Italy dragged on through 2020 and 2021. The court overseeing the case tried to unravel the Sorgente Group's assets and distribute proceeds among creditors. The Flatiron Building represented a significant part of the portfolio's value, but also a significant liability. Any buyer would have to accept not just the building, but also the responsibility for completing the renovation. Creditors competed for position. Some wanted to force a sale of the building immediately, even at a reduced price, to recover some of their money. Others argued that waiting would allow the market to recover, potentially increasing value. The bankruptcy court weighed both sides but issued few definitive decisions. The case stuck in a legal quagmire. Meanwhile, the building remained in limbo. The scaffolding, which was supposed to be temporary, became a permanent feature. Originally installed to protect pedestrians during facade work, it now simply covered the building without any work happening behind it. The city required it to remain in place until the facade was repaired, but no one could fund the repairs during the legal battle. Inside, the building stopped mid-demolition. Some spaces were stripped down to the steel skeleton. Others remained untouched, just as tenants left them in 2019. Desks still stood in some rooms. Filing. Cabinets contained documents. It was as if everyone had gone out for lunch and never came back. Securing the building became an issue. An empty building in Midtown Manhattan attracted homeless people seeking shelter, graffiti artists looking for a canvas, and urban explorers looking for adventure. Owners hired guards to patrol the property, but protecting 22 floors 24 hours a day was expensive. Boarding appeared over some entrances to prevent unauthorized access. The city itself began to intervene. The Department of Buildings issued multiple violations regarding neglected repairs. The terracotta facade continued to deteriorate. More panels cracked. The risk of falling debris grew. The city threatened fines if work was not resumed, but had no clear authority to force a bankrupt entity to act. The architectural community watched with growing concern. The Flatiron Building was one of the most important landmarks of the early skyscraper era in America. Its influence on architecture was overstated. Buildings around the world imitated its boldness and combined form with function in constrained locations. Letting it fall into ruin would be a loss not only for New York, but for architectural history globally. Preservation groups looked into whether intervention would be possible. The National Trust for Historic Preservation listed the Flatiron on its list of endangered landmarks. Local organizations explored whether funds could be raised to save the building, but the scale of funding needed was daunting. $100 million or more could not be raised through donations. Any solution would require a private buyer with deep pockets and a long-term vision. Several potential buyers conducted due diligence. Each backed out after examining the numbers. The cost of purchasing the building plus the cost of finishing the renovation, plus the uncertainty about how quickly it could be leased after completion, all added up to an equation that made no financial sense, at least not for investors seeking reasonable returns within a reasonable time frame. By 2022, the situation had stabilized in the worst possible sense. Nothing was getting better, but also not dramatically worse. The building stood. The scaffolding stood. Legal proceedings dragged on. Sporadic negotiations between potential buyers and the bankruptcy court led nowhere. The Flatiron Building was an icon frozen in time, unable to move forward, refusing to disappear. Tourists returning to New York as travel resumed continued to come to Madison Square. They photographed the building as always, but now photos showed scaffolding and barriers. Postcards selling in nearby shops showed the Flatiron in its glory without mention of its current state. The disconnect between image and reality was striking. Local newspapers published articles every few months documenting the lack of progress. Each article told the same story with slightly different details. The building was still empty. The bankruptcy case was still unresolved. Renovation was unscheduled. Potential buyers were looking, but none were making offers. The story was depressingly consistent. By 2023, new complications appeared. Some creditors in the bankruptcy case argued that the prolonged delay was diminishing the asset's value. The longer the building stood empty, the harder it would become to eventually fill it with tenants. The office market in New York was not recovering as quickly as optimists had predicted. Remote work remained popular. Many companies had permanently reduced their office space requirements. A new round of negotiations began between the bankruptcy court and interested parties. Some creditors wanted to lower the asking price for the building to attract serious buyers. Others objected, arguing that selling at a depressed value would cheat people owed money by Sorgente. The court heard arguments and weighed options, but issued few decisive actions. In 2024, reports emerged that a group of New York developers was forming a consortium to potentially buy the building. The plan allegedly involved finishing the renovation and then converting some floors to mixed use. Simbris in mixed combining offices with cultural or educational spaces. The Landmarks Preservation Commission would have to approve any conversion, but early talks suggested openness to creative solutions that would preserve the building while allowing it to function economically. By the time this narrative was written in early 2025, no final deal had been announced. The building remained in the possession of an entity controlled by the bankruptcy court in Italy. Negotiations continued. Potential buyers evaluated options. The city tallied violations. Preservation groups watched, and the Flatiron Building stood silent, its windows dark, its corridors empty. New York's most famous icon stuck in the longest suspension it had ever known. The emptiness of the Flatiron Building reveals a paradox embedded in historic preservation. The building received legal protection precisely because it was architecturally and culturally important. Landmark status was supposed to ensure its survival. Instead, protection created restrictions that made profitable use almost impossible. The building cannot be demolished, but it also cannot be easily adapted to modern needs. The economics are brutal. A renovation requiring over $100 million must generate sufficient rental income to justify the investment. In the best market conditions, office space in the Flatiron could rent at premium rates due to location and prestige. But the building does not offer what modern companies need. Open floor plans are impossible due to the triangular geometry and preservation requirements regarding maintaining the corridor layout. Advanced technical infrastructure would have to be wedged into a building designed before computers, air, conditioning, or modern telecommunication systems. Even if these technical challenges were overcome, the question of demand remains. The office market in New York after the pandemic has fundamentally changed. Companies require less space. Remote work has become a permanent feature of many industries. Vacancy rates in Class A buildings throughout Manhattan have risen. Competition for tenants is intense. The Flatiron would compete with newer buildings offering everything the Flatiron lacks at comparable or lower rents. Conversion to residential use offered a potential solution, but the Landmarks Preservation Commission consistently rejected such plans. The regulations are not arbitrary. They exist to protect historic features from destruction in the name of profit. The Flatiron has functioned as an office building since 1902. This continuity of use is historical in itself. Transforming the interior into apartments would erase this history. The paradox becomes sharper. The strictest protection leads to the greatest danger. A building that cannot generate revenue eventually deteriorates, regardless of how many legal documents protect it from demolition. Preservation requires maintenance. Maintenance requires money. Money comes from usage. If regulations make usage impossible to achieve profitably, the building slowly falls apart. Other American cities struggled with similar problems. The Woolworth Building, another early skyscraper in downtown Manhattan, went through years of financial difficulties before a developer finally converted the upper floors into luxury condominiums in 2015. The commission approved this project because the original building was designed as an office building with apartments on top. Precedent existed. The Flatiron had no such precedent. Other cities lost landmarks entirely. The Singer Building, once the tallest building in the world, was demolished in 1968. Before preservation, laws could protect it. Pennsylvania Station, as mentioned earlier, fell in 1963. These demolitions shook public consciousness and led to the creation of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. But now preservationists faced a different challenge. Saving buildings from demolition was an achievement. Finding a way for these buildings to live economically was a harder problem. Some experts suggest that regulations require evolution. Rigid adherence to original use can condemn buildings to death by neglect. Flexibility could allow for adaptive reuse that preserves key historic elements while allowing buildings to function in the modern economy. Others warn that too much flexibility would invite developers to destroy what made the buildings worth preserving in the first place. Public subsidies offer another possible path. Governments could support the preservation of buildings of outstanding cultural importance through tax breaks, grants, or direct funding. New York has some programs supporting landmark renovation, but none operate on the scale necessary to save something like the Flatiron. $150 million exceeds what most public programs can reasonably contribute to a private sector project. Public-private partnership models were explored. The city could take over the building and partner with a private developer who would offer expertise and part of the funding in exchange for long-term lease rights or co-ownership. These structures worked elsewhere. The Flatiron's complexities, both legal and financial, made such arrangements difficult to negotiate. The concept of a museum or cultural space periodically appeared. Transforming the Flatiron into a museum of architecture or New York history would make symbolic sense. The building itself is an artifact. Visitors could experience an early 20th century interior while learning about the evolution of skyscraper construction. But museums require steady operating funding. Ticket revenue rarely covers full costs. Any museum plan would need to identify an endowment or ongoing support capable of sustaining operations for decades. A boutique hotel remained a theoretical possibility. Tourists are drawn to the Flatiron. Letting them sleep inside could generate revenue while preserving part of the building's historic character. Hotel rooms would not require open floor plans. Narrow corridors would work well for a hotel. Rooms could be small if they were well designed. The challenge lay in convincing the Landmarks Preservation Commission that conversion to a hotel would preserve sufficient historical integrity. A hybrid combining multiple uses could offer the most feasible solution. Lower floors could remain offices or convert to cultural spaces. Middle floors could become a hotel. Upper floors, where views were most spectacular, could potentially convert to apartments if the commission could be convinced that limited conversion was necessary for the building's survival. Such a mix of usage would diversify revenue streams and reduce the risk of dependence on a single market. None of these options were fully explored because ownership remained frozen in bankruptcy proceedings. The court in Italy controlling Sorgente's assets could not hold the building indefinitely, but also could not sell it until creditors reached an agreement. Meanwhile, the Flatiron stood silent, its future uncertain. History offers both warnings and hope. Many buildings survived crises that seemed fatal. Mar-a-Lago, mentioned at the beginning of this narrative, faced demolition in the mid-1980s. The owners could not find a way to maintain it economically. Demolition crews were ready. The building survived because someone found a model that worked. Conversion to a private club was controversial, but generated the revenue necessary to maintain the estate. The difference lies in regulation. Mar-a-Lago did not grapple with the restrictions of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. The owner had the freedom to transform the property in a way that made economic sense. The Flatiron does not have this flexibility. Its protection is also its prison. The irony is that the building's fame might be exactly what prevents its survival. If the Flatiron were less iconic, it might have been modernized or adapted without public scrutiny. But every proposal regarding one of America's most recognizable buildings attracts attention, debate, and opposition. Interest groups guarantee that every plan is scrutinized. The Landmarks Preservation Commission must act cautiously, knowing that its decisions set precedents. By 2025, the Flatiron Building remained in limbo. Physically, it still stands, its steel skeleton solid despite years of neglect. The terracotta facade is deteriorating, but slowly. The building could last for decades more in its current abandoned state. But survival is not the same as living. The most photographed building in New York has become a monument to its own paradox, too important to let disappear, too constrained to develop profitably, too famous to adapt quietly, protected by law that guarantees its form, but not its future. Its emptiness is both a tragedy and a warning. Icons are not immortal. Fame does not pay maintenance bills. Protection without viability is just a slow road to ruin. Will the Flatiron survive another century Almost certainly yes. Will it ever live again as a functional building full of people and purpose? That remains a question without an answer. In these two questions lies the chasm between preservation and life. A chasm that widens with every year as the building stands dark and silent, waiting for a solution that never seems to come.